Welcome, comrades, to this latest session in our education series. Apologies at the beginning. We've managed to advertise this meeting with the wrong title, not once but twice. So it's not about the Spanish Civil War, which we discussed last week. It's also not about the roundtable discussion, which we'll discuss next week. This is about the fight against imperialism in various countries until about 1945. With Kevin Bean, who will introduce this session a bit more coherently than I can, because I thought we're doing something else. Apologies, my mistake. Okay, thank you, Kevin, for joining us once again. So off you go.
Okay, thanks, Tina, and good evening, comrades. Tonight's session is called The Fight Against Imperialism, and it's really looking at various movements for national liberation, for national democracy, and against imperialism that took place in the years between the First and the Second World Wars. The major anti-imperialist struggles, the ones that were both politically significant and indeed the ones that were going to contribute to the overthrow of the former empires, took place in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. And those we'll look at in later sessions, probably in the autumn, maybe later. So I'm really looking at the origins of these movements. The other reason why I wanted to include it in the series was that although Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, United States are obviously very important revolutions and very important countries in terms of the world imperialist system, I did want to make the point that politics and opposition to imperialism was going on coterminous with the events. And when you see, for example, some of the movements I'm going to refer to this evening, you will see that they're taking place alongside, say, the Spanish Civil War. They're taking place alongside the Russian Revolution. And all of these movements then, I think, become interlinked. Indeed, one of the important reasons why I wanted to talk about this wider fight against imperialism is to show that struggles throughout the world are linked. They're often linked by big forces and big events. People, for example, in the various colonial empires, look to the Russian Revolution as a form of inspiration. They began to see that, for example, the alternative to imperialism wasn't simply forms of capitalist democracy, but actually many people took active inspiration from the attempt to build a new society in the Soviet Union. And likewise, struggles in various parts of the British Empire in particular were inspirational for each other. So that, for example, the movement in Ireland in the period 1916 to 22, 23 was followed very closely by people in India and Egypt. And indeed, in the years that followed, many Indian nationalists regarded the Irish struggle as something of a model that they might follow. So those are, I think, quite important connections. And indeed, this idea that struggles throughout the world were all interlinked and were, in a sense, part of a general struggle, have become, I think, more important in hindsight, but were clearly there at the time. So what I'm going to do this evening is to talk very broadly about the nature of these movements. Obviously, there's a lot going on in many different countries, and I can't deal with it in detail. And indeed, if there are comrades who are taking part in the session, have got detailed knowledge or expertise and so on, please come in and share it. I'm more familiar. I'm more familiar with some countries than others, and so I'm always willing to share the expertise, as it were. Okay, so the fight against imperialism. Well, the major factor that I think we need to consider is the impact of the First World War and obviously the Russian Revolution. And imperialism emerged in many ways discredited, battered, and indeed facing many severe threats following that war. The major colonial empires had fought themselves almost to a standstill, And indeed, the war itself led to the destruction of at least one major colonial empire in the form of the Turkish Empire, but also the ending of Germany's colonies. And indeed, of course, the Russian Revolution led to the end of Tsarism and really a whole new development in world politics. So a non-capitalist state emerged, which in a sense not only sort of proves a beacon for Europe, but indeed for the oppressed throughout the world. And various movements arise directly from that. The other week, we heard from Ed Boba talking about the centenary and the development of the Chinese Communist Party. And that was an excellent example of the way that a movement could take inspiration from the Russian Revolution, but also to see the movement as part of a much longer struggle for the development of their countries. Many of the movements that we're talking about here had their origins in the 19th century. And these were movements that were fighting primarily for forms of self-government initially, but then for forms of national democracy and indeed independence. And the question that was to arise was what form of independence would that be? What form would that take? And indeed, how was that to be achieved? So many of the movements, such as the Indian National Congress, the various movements in Egypt, often began with attempts to persuade in this case, the British Empire, to carry out particular reforms. And so it was often posed in terms of democracy, in terms of forms of self-government. The leaders of many of these movements, not only in India and Egypt, but the same will be true for many other colonies, particularly in the French African Empire, were members of a relatively small educated elite. I would think that for people in Britain, we're all fairly familiar through our own popular culture of the career of Gandhi, how he becomes a lawyer, how he comes into contact with the British legal system, and indeed spends time in London, South Africa, and elsewhere. And indeed is in a sense formed through contact with not only the empire, but other aspects of the empire's culture and politics. And the experience of Gandhi is fairly typical. So the argument that many of these opponents have is, well, if we want to develop our countries, what sort of route are we going to take? And that leads often to a tension within these movements between ideas of negotiating with the imperial power, attempting to persuade the imperial power that a gradual process of change, democratization can occur, or ideas of some sort of revolutionary struggle. And of course, given the powers of the empire, given its abilities to control the territories concerned, revolution isn't always the first option. And indeed, if it is to be some sort of revolutionary struggle, what form will that struggle take? Will it take, for example, a terroristic form? In India, in Bengal, there are various terroristic movements in many ways modeled on the movements of revolutionary Russia before 1914, groups like the SRs. And also, I suppose as well, the relationship between these often quite small educated minorities, members often of the colonial administrative class, teachers, civil servants, lawyers, or even members of the colonial elite, the elite groups in the various countries, often landowners, who participate or collaborate with the imperialist system in some ways. And particularly in a society like India, where you have a vast gulf between these groups in terms of education and of status and of income, and the mass of the population, many of whom live in the countryside, many of whom are desperately poor. So you can see that the strategies that these groups adopt, the discussions that take place within them, will take many forms, and we will see those forms unfolding in the years before the Second World War. The other factor that I want to stress is, I suppose, the interconnections between imperialism and the imperialist system and the dynamics that shape the politics of those particular countries. In the case of the British Empire, the assumptions of British imperialists was that the empire would probably evolve into a different framework. Before the First World War, it was very clear that the so-called white dominions, countries like Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, were in effect self-governing. And indeed, this was formally recognized in several pieces of legislation in the 1900s. It was to, I suppose, culminate with the situation in the years just after the First World War, when in a number of colonial interventions in Turkey, it was very clear that the Canadian government in particular, the Australians as well, expressed reservations and in a sense were acting as sovereign powers. These were enshrined in various further pieces of legislation, such as the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which in a sense recognized that the British Empire was now a federation of self-governing colonies or former colonies, which had very close relationship with Britain. The king was still the head of state, was still the empire, but even the phrase the British Commonwealth denotes a different relationship. Now, this is not the sort of cozy evolutionist ideas that we often see about the British family of nations, the Commonwealth of Nations sort of evolving, because of course the bulk of the empire was not made up of the so-called white dominions. It was in fact a series of colonies. And in the years after the First World War, the British Empire, and also if we extend that by implication to the other main European empires, particularly the French and the Dutch, in some senses, the direct territorial control of the British Empire and these other empires was at their height. The British Empire, for example, gained a number of former German colonies after 1918. And so it actually includes more territory than was the case before the war. But the future direction of that empire, it was envisaged, would still remain essentially under direct British control. But as movements began to develop in Egypt and in India in particular, and of course in Ireland, which I'll deal with in a moment, the argument began to develop, could the empire be maintained in its old form? In the case of India, direct British control rested upon not just a police and army force, but of course the collaboration of a number of native rulers, Maharajas and so forth, but also a bureaucracy drawn from the Indian population. It also relied to a certain extent on divide and rule, with certain populations being privileged or being given in relatively different status, and of course playing off these patterns. The same was also true, of course, in the colonies in Africa, where political development was at a lower level, but where the same patterns were going to emerge and were going to develop. Now, the main empires still were fairly secure. That the French and the Dutch Empire in particular faced no real serious challenges. There were movements in Algeria and in some of the coastal areas of North Africa, but these were often quite small, and what the important point about them is they'd not yet extended really far into the mass of the population. But the two exceptions to this in terms of anti-colonial movements were the movements in India and in Egypt. I've talked already about India and about the nature of its role, and obviously the development of the Indian National Congress. Now, this was an interesting movement because, like many of the other successful movements, it drew much of its methodology, much of its organizational form, and indeed much of its politics from those of the metropolitan countries, the main capitalist countries. So in the form of the newspaper, of the rally, of the meeting, all of the patterns of politics that were recognizable. And indeed, we know from correspondence and from other connections that the models of politics in other countries were sort of picked up and developed. So the Congress movement developed very rapidly in the years after the First World War. And of course, British imperialism's response was to be a fairly harsh one. The Amritsar Massacre in 1919, which is, again, I'm sure comrades will be very familiar with, was one attempt to deal with this. But the form of the protest movement and what made it, I think, so serious was that it was a mass movement. It had extended beyond small groups of intellectuals. And as with the Chinese Communist movement that we heard in the recent weeks, it had started from very small beginnings, but was now moving beyond the cities and also into the countryside. But of course, one of the problems of a movement of this character is that almost by definition, and almost because a society like India, or indeed, the same can be true of any other colonial country, large parts of the population are rural. The forms of organization can often become spontaneous. They can be, in a sense, difficult to control for a leadership that, for example, sees its function as securing negotiations, of securing some sort of accommodation. So Gandhi's movement often veered in this period between protest movements, particularly the idea of passive and non-violent resistance. It often veered in that way to other forms of mass protest, which often took on a violent form, particularly when confronted with the repression of the British state. And Gandhi's reading of the situation was that the British would come to terms, and that what he was now essentially arguing for, what he was essentially attempting to do, was to use the pressure of the masses to secure some sort of compromise, some forms of self-government. And it's this sort of balancing which I think is an important factor. The same sort of movement developed in Egypt, again in roughly the same period, 1919 to 21, 22. It too took the form of mass protests, and the so-called Wafd movement did exactly the same sort of thing. It too relied upon the relative weaknesses of the British state after the First World War, and of course it was functioning alongside the Congress movement, and of course it was functioning alongside the movement in Ireland. So if you were in the British cabinet in about 1920, 1921, you were facing with protest movements, armed insurrections, civil disobedience, campaigns for self-government and independence in 3 of your major colonies, in Ireland, in Egypt, and in India. And these movements would in a sense see themselves as part of these wider chains, linked in that way. Now, one of the points about the nature of these movements is that in many senses they were developing very rapidly, not only in an unstable world in terms of imperialism, but also in a period of rapid change in the economies and the societies concerned. And it's that I perhaps want to go back a little earlier to the idea of imperialism. And of course, we're all familiar with the idea of empire, of colonies, of an imperial country taking control of a society, putting the flag up and soldiers and so on, conquest and so forth. But I think just as important is the economic system. And of course, imperialism as it develops, as Lenin and others, particularly German and European social democracy, were discovering, that this was in fact a much wider system, and that in particular as an economic system, it relied upon the developed economy exporting goods, perhaps more importantly, importing, or in many cases effectively stealing raw materials from the colony. And so the relationship was often much more focused on economic exploitation than simply military rule in that way. In the case of Britain, increasingly that exploitation took the form of the export of capital, and particularly the development of infrastructure and commercial functions, rather than simply seeing the colonies as markets for goods. And indeed, in many of the British colonies, Egypt, but particularly in India, native industries began to develop, particularly around the great cities of India, which again had been great commercial centers before the British had arrived. And so what you get, and again, very much a global pattern, is the development of a native capitalist class, often quite a small capitalist class, one that in many ways is tied into imperialism, but one which also has its own interests, and indeed is in a position to develop its own interests, and in fact increasingly wants protection, wants to control its own domestic market. So much of the impetus for demands for self-government are demands to take control of their own home market, indeed their own economy. The initial phase, the initial phase doesn't call for complete independence. Indeed, to a certain extent, it realizes that this is going to be difficult, utopian, that the imperial power may not allow it. But it sees its model as, for example, that of one of the dominions, Canada or in Australia. And indeed, it does appear that in the 20s and the 30s, this will be the model that will develop in India. The question is the rate of change, the pace of change, but also how much power will be in the hands of the local capitalists and other members of the elite, but also the relationship with the metropolitan country as well. What form will that relationship take? So there are clear forces behind these national movements. In terms of how the movements are framed, I think we also have to remember that many of the territories and many of the nations that we're describing are very much the products of imperialism. India, the concept of India is obviously an ancient one, but the concept of India as a single political entity, and indeed the nature of that entity, is, I think, less well developed. The same is also true of many of the other African colonies, where territories are arbitrarily joined together. And of course, we have in the Middle East, with the case of Sykes-Picot, we have exactly that, with the straight lines on the maps and the creation of territories which are given to client rulers, as in the Hashemites in Jordan, Transjordan, and Iraq, the developments of monarchies there. So the national movements develop often within the context of a political framework laid down by imperialism. And so the idea of a particular nation often wielding together different ethnic, religious groups who in other ways might well be in historical competition with each other, and certainly in terms of a competition that's being exacerbated or emphasized by imperialism. This will be one of the key stages, one of the key phases in these movements. And this development occurs, fairly rapidly. The formation of national democratic movements from the late 19th century, clearly taking models from Europe, clearly taking models from revolutionary traditions there. That then starts to diffuse, starts to move out much wider than merely the urban populations. These demands are often linked not just to abstractions or simple political demands, but they're also linked to ideas of land reform and change. And they have within them often quite complex and contradictory elements. So that, for example, to mobilize your population, you may need to say that the new nation will improve social conditions. That the implication is that the rural poor will get land, that the rural poor will have improvements in their lives. But of course, that will then run counter to the demands of, say, the rural elites, the landowners, the better off peasants. It might also run counter to the interests of the urban groups. So within these movements, there are often tensions on class lines in this way. And indeed, there are also tensions in the types of ideology that are used. One of Gandhi's successes is that although he does draw upon an idea of a traditional India, indeed, he, in his own personality, his own arguments and ideas of sort of taking up the traditional dress of a Hindu holy man in this way, he does this quite consciously. He sees this as a way of mobilizing the masses in India, but he doesn't simply frame this as a Hindu movement. So he's not an equivalent of Modi. Indeed, he's actually assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. So his method there is, for example, to try to unite people through the idea that within existing elements of the traditional society are forms of modernization. And so there is actually very much an argument for modernization, for example, the ending of the caste system and of various forms of discrimination. And of course, the methods that he's using of mass mobilizations, although they're often framed in terms of rather sort of saintly pacifism, they do in fact involve confrontations with the imperialist state, and of course with their local collaborators. So within these movements, there are these these very important tensions in this way. The other element that I think is important for us to consider is the impact of the Russian Revolution and how these movements are discussed by what will be in many of these countries quite small communist movements, or of left-wing movements which are influenced by the patterns in the Soviet Union. And indeed, Lenin and others devoted a considerable amount of attention to try and look at the trajectory of these movements. Again, this goes back to discussions in the European socialist movement before 1914, and in particular, how far or whether socialists should support the right for national self-determination, or indeed for the breakup of the empires. There was a very strong body of opinion. It was particularly represented in German social democracy, but it was also fairly strong, you would not be surprised to learn, in the British Labour movement, of a type of left pro-imperialism. I use the word left in inverted commas there. These arguments usually turned upon the ideas of a type of paternalistic imperialism, that the natives were not yet fit for self-government. And so the empire would be a type of educative process, that the imperialist country would act in loco parentis. And once the natives had sort of grown to be adults, then they could be sort of pushed off into independence. But in the meantime, they would be tutored. And of course, the material conditions that of the populations in the imperial country, these clearly rested upon exploitation and unequal economic relationships. So those must be allowed to continue. The Fabians in Britain particularly developed these theories, but so did many of the German right in the social democracy. Bernstein, for example, one of the so-called revisionists there, was also quite a keen pro-imperialist. So this idea that imperialism was in some senses progressive, and indeed that it should be supported, was in many ways blown apart by the First World War, and in particular the arguments that the First World War was a war for colonies and that colonies were exploitative. There was also a debate about what, in a sense, the progressive nature of empire, and whether empires, through developing the economy, through developing the working class, were in a sense part of an historical pattern of progress. And indeed, this goes back a little further into the 19th century and to the discussions that Marx and others had about capitalist development. Now, Lenin's argument, which I think became very influential in the communist movement and was going to become influential as more formalized left parties, communist parties, working class movements, trade unions began to form, was to support the demands for self-determination. In other words, to argue that the empire should be ended and that the territory should have the right of self-determination. And indeed, this became quite an important political set of demands, not only in terms of the communist movement, but also in a sense between the battle for the future, I think, of world politics after 1918. Again, comrades may be aware that the American President Woodrow Wilson had taken up this slogan in a way as a sort of counter to the demands of the Bolsheviks, who made the right of nations to self-determination one of their important features. To argue that if nations were being oppressed, then they should be freed, but of course that workers should voluntarily want to unite, that nations should want to voluntarily cooperate together in an international framework, hence the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics rather than merely a Russian empire rebranded in this way. So the political potency of this was recognized by Wilson, and he argued that in a sense this had to be conceded. Now, his concession of this right only applied to Europe. It only really applied to essentially in Eastern Europe, because it was denied to the Irish at the Versailles Conference, and of course it was denied to groups like the Egyptians and to the Indians as well, who were beginning to make these demands. So the debate about the future of the world movement, about the future of empire, was very much on the cards at this point. And it was Britain, the British Empire, which faced those problems most severely in the three territories that I referred to. Now, the Irish question is in many senses a sort of both a prototype, but also an indication of the problems that the British Empire faced. The Irish movement, which again had considerable history, had reached a point in 1918 when it was clear that the majority of the Irish population wanted, at the very least, extensive self-government. The demand was for a republic, which of course would mean separation from the empire. So this was a really clear break. Now the strategy of the British government in many ways mirrors what they're going to do elsewhere. And that was, of course, the historical use of divide and rule. Similar patterns have developed in India and in other colonies. So the unionist population in the northeastern counties of Ireland, partition of the island, all of these were all ways of, in a sense, using that divide and rule tactic. But the other tactic was often to give forms of concession. So, for example, to stop short at full independence, but simply to give a limited form of self-government within the empire. So in 1922, the Irish Free State is created, which has a very limited form of self-government within the British Empire. And again, this will often be a model for what's going to develop later on. So we have an imperialist strategy of trying to maintain rule by both repression, but also by forms of political concession, and in particularly by attempting to use a section of the population who maybe are, demanding independence, to offer them concessions, and in a sense to split and to detach part of that movement. This is something that the British try very much in India. They try to give concessions in the 30s, for example. They give a new constitution which gives a degree of self-government in many areas to the Indian population. They establish provincial assemblies, but again, central direction remains very clearly in the hands of Britain. And indeed, in the case of very strongly pro-imperialist politicians like Churchill, there is going to be absolutely no concession at all. And indeed, Churchill, both in the earlier period and later, was very clearly in favor of a hard line on this, because India in many ways was central to the British Empire. Again, we perhaps lost sight of that now, or at least it's less emphasized, but it was, in the words of the old cliche, the jewel in the crown. And for Churchill, losing that jewel in the crown would really signal the end of really British domination in that part of the world. It's also why the situation in Ireland was so significant, because of course, not only was Ireland physically very close to Britain, but also it was somewhere where there'd been a long, persistent campaign for independence, for self-government, and to make very serious concessions, for example, to grant an independent republic, would also have had that domino effect. So I think, just to conclude, comrades, that in these early periods, we're seeing the beginnings of these movements. These are still, they're still taking shape. They're starting to move from movements of relatively small groups of educated intellectuals now into mass movements. And of course, they're movements which are starting to take on a whole range of other demands other than simple national independence. But of course, there's a time lag. Over large parts of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire. Remember, the Dutch had a fairly extensive empire in Indonesia and in the East Indies. Those empires are still relatively secure. What I think begins to shift there is, of course, the impact of the Second World War. And that, I think, is as much political as it is economic. And by that, I mean that the loss of prestige that the empires faced with the defeats. Remember that the Japanese dealt Britain fairly heavy military blows in the Far East. Pardon me, sorry. And so to see the imperial power being defeated by another Asiatic power, I think was a very severe blow to the prestige of the empire. That was particularly the case in India, where large numbers of people in the 1940s, 1942, supported the Quit India campaign in the midst of that war. So what you have, I think, is in many senses the reality of a weakening imperial power, the reality that the masses in those countries could actually take charge of their own destiny. But of course, their leaderships were often very equivocating, and indeed they were often afraid of their own populations. And so that tension between the leaders of the nationalist movements and their own followers is going to be quite important. In the French Empire, particularly in North Africa, we start to see in this period the growth of some forms of opposition, usually around magazines and newspapers, again quite confined to intellectuals and sections of the middle class, and also very clearly influenced by developments in the United States, the Black movement there, developments in Europe, the growth of the left in Europe. So these movements often cross-fertilize. A recent book, which I've put onto the reading list by Gopal, talks about the interaction between British dissidents and the various anti-colonial movements. And I think it's important to note that there was this interchange, that many people came from the colonies to London as students, and it was here that they often cross-fertilized ideas, were in touch with the radical left, and indeed, in a sense, were often radicalized and then went back home to develop national movements in this way. But it was the post-Second World War period, the changing geopolitics, the relative strengthening of the USSR, the real weakening of the British Empire, the way that the war had really sort of drained the blood from it, put it in deep debt to American imperialism. And of course, American imperialism then added the final blow, demanding, in a sense, decolonization as its price for supporting Britain. So the British Empire may, in a sense, have won its war. It may well have survived the war and helped and defeated German imperialism, but in a way, it was a Pyrrhic victory. And of course, it will be not just the decline of the empires, but the rise of the national liberation movements, which will start to sweep across the French Empire. They will start to develop in Africa. They will sweep away the empires in Asia, so that the map of the world, which shows green, red, pink, and other colors of European empires, is already looking faded, and by the 1940s is changing radically. So that in the 50s and the 60s, the French in Indochina, and then later the development of that movement in the Vietnam War with the Americans will all be part of this. The campaign in Algeria, again, will be an inspiration to other movements. And of course, the anti-colonial wars, which will develop in Portugal's colonies in Mozambique and Angola, and of course the decolonization process that will occur in Africa, in Kenya, and later on in countries like Tanzania and Zimbabwe and so forth. So we're at the beginnings of this stage, and we are in a way seeing the changes in the empires, but we're also seeing a new geopolitical balance, and that, of course, we will have to discuss when we're looking at events after the Second World War. So that's my introduction, comrades, and I'll now hand it over to you to come in with your comments.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Comrades, if you have a contribution to make or a question, can you please click raise hand at the bottom of your screen? Obviously, this session covered quite a number of issues and countries, etc. So there probably is plenty to discuss, and yet none of you have their hands up. Come on.
Tina,
Anybody?
before
Yes.
we do, I'm having one of my my technical problems, so my screen is now blank. So I'm afraid you will have to tell me any questions or any comments.
Okay, all right.
And my apologies for that. Yeah.
No worries. At the moment, there are no questions and no hands up. So this might be the fastest session we've ever had, because it was so clear and nobody has any questions. Oh, suddenly 3 of them gone up. 4. Okay. Oh, now they're all coming. Okay, hold on. I'll have to make you all into panelists. Jesus, there's plenty of them now. Okay. Sorry, comrades, one after the other. This will only take a little while. Okay, let's see if we have got anybody there yet. Okay, you're first. You got your camera on, Dave. That makes you the first person from the floor. Hello.
The first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Kevin,
thank you very much for that really wide survey. And by wide, I don't mean because it was thin. There was a lot of depth as well. Thank you. A question for me is, to what extent was the role of Japan a sort of interesting exception, by which I'll be very clear my definition. Because of the sort of almost client state nature of Japan in its relationship with the British Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, the actual catalyst of the Great Depression was probably really important as a sort of divergence again. To what extent do we look at the Depression as an acceleration of threats to great empires such as the British Empire, in the sense that previous empires such as German or Italy or others were sort of impoverished and looked again for overseas or conquest, or in the case of Japan, literally it was about feeding people, seen as a national desperation, particularly from the 1920s onwards. And that obviously has an impact on the general dynamic of what you were talking about with the role of the empires which were long established. I hope I've made myself clear. Sorry.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Tony wants to go next because he has to leave the meeting soon. Oh. Tony, there's something wrong with your microphone. You sound like a cartoon character. And now we can't hear you at all. Hold on. You are switched on, but we can't hear you say anything. Sorry. Do you wanna switch off and switch on or something? I'll take Susan in the meantime. Sorry, Tony. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. I'd like to know to what extent you think the opposition to socialist movements in particular is down to the racism that was basically the justification for colonialism and empires in the first place, and that has continued right the way through, particularly Western society, in order to justify or to ignore their own history. Because it seems to me that the point about Marxism is that it is an international egalitarian movement. It's a, it is literally a unite the workers of the world. It does not see the hierarchy that colonialism depended upon.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to take Neville. Hello, comrade. Long time no see.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, I would just like to invite Kevin to address a couple of questions that I've got, and it's regarding Indochina area, really. And Kevin did mention that from Indochina, then there were quite a lot of lefties that sort of settled in, particularly France and in the UK, in terms of being a student over a period of time. One of those was the bringer of light, Ho Chi Minh, who was the founder of the French Communist Party, I believe. And having sort of grappled with the problem of Vietnam, which for me was a real political awakening and decade that stretched from Vietnam and then 10 years later, like the debacle that occurred in Chile, was the concept in my head remains rather confused in terms of the divide and rule, because Ho Chi Minh visited the USSR, spoke and sought advice from Lenin, did the same thing in the United States and was given a promise that there would be support for uniting Vietnam. But then it sort of descended, and there was a sort of treacherous turn, as far as I can see, from the United States in them withdrawing that support. But the divide and rule concept, I see as probably being very difficult for the French, because in South Vietnam, then the absolute minority was the Roman Catholics that had sort of been browbeaten to some extent, and the majority was very much the Buddhists. But the VC was drawn from both sides of that hostile divide that existed. In fact, you know, there was a scramble to the north to get trained when Vietnam going. And, you know, one of Ho Chi Minh's sayings was, "We're everywhere, but we're nowhere. You can't find us." And it just seems to spread confusion, in as much as that if there were volunteers to join VC from both the Catholic population in the south and the Buddhist population in the south, you know, how did America hang? Well, we know how America hung on. They sort of burnt people, burnt villages, and sort of left a scorched earth policy. So if you'd like to come back on that issue, Kevin, I would very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Neville. Jerry Downing, please.
Okay. In today's Morning Star, there's an article by one Nick Wright, if people know who he is. The Labour movement can only support a united Ireland, he says, having a go at Keir Starmer's support for the United Kingdom and against the reunification of Ireland. Anyways, he finishes his piece with a statement. He says, "The Irish question, in inverted commas, is at heart a democratic question that the working class in Britain must finally grasp, for it is central to its own social emancipation," and etc. But of course, that's a very conflicted question in Ireland, and always has been. James Connolly didn't think that it was just a democratic question. He formed the Irish Republican Socialist Party, particularly because he saw the need for revolutionary socialism. And then he joined the 1916 uprising while he still saw that. So the question of who is it that benefits from the expulsion of British troops from Ireland, and who fights for it, it's very significant. I think that you must see what happens to the British working class and the United States working class and to the working class in the imperialist countries itself, because of the struggles for empire. In 1920, 21, 22, when that whole conflict reached its height, there was huge class struggle within Britain itself, and there was very significant sympathy for the IRA against the British Army and against the Black and Tans. The size of the demonstrations in South London at Terence McSweeney's funeral were very significant, and the Labour leaders and the trade union bureaucracy had to struggle might and main to stop that upsurge of support, because and I would have mentioned that in the Irish War itself, for instance, Tom Barry boasted that he had defeated 10-1 the British forces at Crossbarry, but in fact maybe they were only 5-1 or something, but it was very clear that the British troops at Crossbarry didn't want to fight. They didn't see the IRA as their main enemy, and they retreated in front of a very substantially smaller force than themselves. So that was because of what was happening within Britain itself. You remember that Black Friday came between the truce and the treaty, and Black Friday was where the trade union bureaucracy abandoned the Triple Alliance and shit on the miners and allowed them to go down to defeat. The rank and file movement wasn't able to overcome that treachery by Thomas and by the rest of the Labour leaders, but it was a very significant movement. Actually, the two forces that united to defeat that struggle were, of course, the trade union bureaucracy of the here, and of course the pro-treaty people who signed the who signed the treaty and then fought the Civil War and smashed that movement and gave us modern Ireland, which is only recently becoming overcoming that with its mother and child misogynist Catholic Church dominate society. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I think with a subject like ours, that it's quite understandable that there's a lot of questions on a lot of issues. You can still raise your hand. I'm just going to bring Kevin in now to reply to a few things. Tony put in the chat what he was going to ask, but it's not a full question, so I don't think it makes much sense. He was going to comment on a revisionist thesis put over by Eugene Rogan in a talk for the Balfour Project on how Britain was pro-imperialist, not pro-Zionist or pro-Arab. I'm not sure that is enough for you to comment on or
could you
say
just
anything.
repeat it a second?
Okay.
I have come across it, but
Okay, so his question or comment was going to be on a revisionist thesis put over by Eugene Rogan in a talk for the Balfour Project on how Britain was pro-imperialist, not pro-Zionist or pro-Arab. And his short comment is that that's unsustainable, and I've done a blog on it, but I'm not sure what's in that blog. But
yeah,
unsustainable.
no, I've looked at it.
Feel free to ignore.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Okay, fire away then.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, comrades. I must apologize again for the state of my screen. If I'm looking at you strangely, it's because my lights, it keeps on flickering, and also the sound is distorted, so it's a bit disconcerting. Okay, first of all, Dave, on Japan, I think Japan is a very interesting case study, and I think your characterization of its relationship with Britain is accurate in one sense. Although I think its distance from Britain, and also its ability, I know that the debates on the nature of Japan, and in particular the relationship in terms of its modernization and the comparisons between, say, Japan and Germany, the relationship between the feudal aristocracy carrying out that modernization, do make it quite an interesting case study. And I think they do make the point, and I think Jerry made it in a similar way, although it's a very different situation, is that often sort of native ruling classes will act as intermediaries between their own populations and will, in a sense, try to sort of carve out a position for themselves. So often when, a ruling class comes into contact with imperialism, as would have been the case throughout large parts of the world, many of them decide to make the decision to cooperate. And I think in Japan's case, that's what they did. But in a sense, they played that system quite well. They had a number of advantages, and they then use those very well, and very effectively. On the on the question of the Great Depression of the 1930s, yes, that is a very important, I think, process, because I think not only does it draw more sections of the economy, paradoxically, it draws in sections of the rural society into the world economy, and in a way, this sort of disaster almost sort of reinforces their connections. But it also, of course, is has, I think, quite important political and psychological effects. So I'd agree that the war, the Second World War, and the Great Depression are going to have that effect. Also, you can already see, and again, in the case of Britain, that those industries which relied on colonial markets, for example, cotton and some other manufacturers, were already facing competition from their former colonies, or indeed their current colonies. And you could then again see the way that the relationship was becoming not sustainable from a capitalist point of view. Although the point was that really well into the 70s, the imperialist heartlands were still the dominant manufacturing and economic powers in the world. But the writing, I think, was already on the wall. And I mentioned cotton because of the connections with India, and the fact that that Lancashire, had exported a large amount of its material there. There are also a couple of other interesting countries which don't quite follow the patterns that I've described. One is, of course, Turkey, which, of course, is a former empire, but it undertakes a sort of modernization project under Kemal Ataturk. And that, again, has certain similarities, although, again, its geographical position and some of its economic determinants are not like those of Japan. So I suppose what it shows is that imperialism's connections with the so-called periphery, between the metropolis and the periphery, often take on different forms. And you might well think of other countries which have allowed client states to develop, and then find that the client states sort of overtake them, and indeed, outshine them in that way. The other two countries which, again, take on a different pattern development, one is Iran, which would have been known in Europe as Persia in this period, and of course China, which Ed looked at last time. And these, I suppose, in terms of political movements, and this would also be the case, I think, with Turkey, is that their consciousness of a long history of having, in a sense, not just a national, but indeed a sort of state-nation identity, which gives them, I think, a coherence, is also then useful to shape movements that form against imperialism. And I think Ed talked about that in terms of China, quite effectively. It means, for example, that the national movements develop in those countries have already quite a strong basis to work from. I think the same is also true of the Egyptian movement. And then, of course, in Japan, you've got, as with China, you've got that idea of a sort of civilization state. And that's going to be quite potent, I think, in the 30s and the 40s. The Japanese state deliberately uses its idea of being a sort of Asiatic power that recognizes, although this is only for their own interests, of course, but it recognizes the European colonies in Asia as equals. It even establishes, political conferences, and although these are all very much puppet regimes, they are in marked contrast to the way that the European powers, formally regard many of their conquered countries. But Japan is, I think, an interesting example, and it sort of shows the interactions between various countries, and imperialism can take different forms. Susan's points about race and so on are, I think, interesting. I think they probably deserve a different, they arise as sort of they deserve a different meeting, a separate meeting, I think, particularly on race. Imperialism, when it develops, certainly in its form, say, from the 17th, 16th and 17th century, has really quite different ideas on race. Essentially, I think race and class become, the two determinants there. So the European colonizers don't initially pose any forms of sort of racial inferiority. I don't mean that they regard the people they're dealing with as equals. They conquer them, they exploit them, but the exploitation is simply that of being done through force. So, for example, the Spanish in Latin America initially deal with the aristocracies and the kingdoms that they come across. They deal with them as equals. They actually treat them as kings and so on, and even bring some of their nobles over to Spain to negotiate with them. And the same is true also with some of the contacts between the British in India. And in fact, the argument is that they're there to exploit as opposed to simply racially exterminate. Now, of course, that changes, I think, over the course of time. And you could even make the same point about slavery, that the first slavery is not necessarily in terms of color or race, so-called race, but actually in terms of class, and indeed the conditions of other enslaved peoples are not simply in terms of ethnicity. So it's with the development of empire that those identifications develop. And they will then, of course, will be very important in terms of solidifying support for imperialism and justifying imperialism. So the type of narrative of racial inferiority, particularly, I think, scientific racism, which developed, will become very different than the early stages. Now, of course, in North America and in Australia, then the programs of effective extermination will develop, but those will I think only be justified in racial terms after the initial colonization. But there is there's a great academic debate, by great I mean it's quite wide-ranging, about race and empire, and whether one is the product or a precondition. But it's certainly, in terms of the mass of the population in the metropolitan countries, the attempts are made to justify empire, I think, not only in practical terms, but also in terms of a civilizing mission. And that's where we then get the ideas of inferiority, which of course then will be taken to their logical extent in terms of scientific racism, and will then reach those extermination programs that, for example, the Germans carry out in southwestern Africa, the British carry out in Tasmania, and the North Americans carry out in both Canada and the United States in that way. But the ideology of imperialism is also, I think, linked into social integration in the home countries. Probably something that's now fading, because obviously society has changed a great deal in the last 100 years. But elements of popular imperialism, in everything from consumer products to pub names to popular culture, are reinforced in this way. There's also, I think, an attempt, particularly, in terms of popular conservative movements. Same is true in Germany with the Pan-German League, and there's also an Imperial League, and obviously then in France as well, which link the destiny of the nation to the empire. Also ideas of expansion to gain territory, and of course, which again, these ideas will sort of reach their apogee in the late 19th century, although they've recently appeared in some strange forms, is of course the idea of the division of the world into dominant powers, and particularly the idea of the English-speaking peoples, the idea of an alliance between the British Empire and the Americans, essentially to almost partition the world. In some readings of that in the late 1890s, Germany would also come in as a partner to that. The Germans could dominate Europe, the British could have their empire, and the Americans could have the Americas. So it was, but it often did rest upon various racialized language. But I think the pattern of development is coterminous with empire. I think ideas of race are not there as the initial justifications. I think they emerge in that way. Neville's points on Indochina really come for the later period, I think in sort of talking about the problems that the Americans had in controlling what was clearly a popular national movement. I think apt, the divisions, religious divisions. The French had developed both drawing upon some semi sort of ethnic or local regional identities that also use religious identities in the same way. This sort of idea of divide and rule is I think, a significant one. They also used other forms of divide and rule in Laos and also in Cambodia as well, or attempted to influence Cambodia using those patterns. The British, I think, are much better at it. They've got more material to work with. And of course, in India, they had myriad regional and national linguistic patterns to work upon. In terms of the importance of Vietnam, I think that it is an important struggle. And, as someone who grew up in that area, in that era, I didn't grow up in Vietnam. I think many of us as teenagers were very influenced by that struggle. Just as our earlier parents and others have been, infused by the struggles in other parts of the British Empire, in Kenya and in Cyprus and elsewhere. But I think the war in Vietnam would repay a lot more study, Neville. So we'll again perhaps look at that next time. Jerry, I think makes some quite interesting points, and I'd agree with him about the importance of the relationship between the British and the Irish working class, and particularly again with the coterminous nature of these events. If you look at the British cabinet minutes, say for 1920 and 21, then you've got reports of instability and unrest and challenge to the system coming in from everywhere. You've got the industrial working class in Britain, you've got events in Ireland, you've got India, you've got Egypt. And, it's very clear that this is an empire and a ruling class that feels itself under threat. And of course, the use of the divide and rule tactic, not only within Ireland itself, but also inside Britain, is obviously a well-established historical fact. So I think you've hit onto an important point there, Jerry. The one, though, that I would also emphasise, and your reference there to South London and Terence McSweeney, it could be replicated really throughout the country. And I've done some little local studies of Tyneside, parts of Scotland, and also of Merseyside. And again, large-scale demonstrations. And importantly, not just Irish people of Irish origin, but obviously members of the British working class, who obviously understand that the reactionaries who are using Ireland as their training ground using the black and tans, the fascisti of the black and tans, will be quite capable of doing the same thing in England. And of course, the use of the various emergency powers, which they then bring to the colony and then they bring them home, is also, I think, going to be very important. And your point about the role of, say, labor and trade union leaders, I think is important, because what will happen in many of the colonial movements and in the years after 1945, we will see this as well, that in many of the empires, the social democratic and trade union leaders will generally side with their ruling classes. They will either be lukewarm in support of independence, or indeed will argue that these people are terrorists and that the imperialist power should stay there to restore order. And that sort of argument, you know, is quite a strong one, quite an important one. And of course, it shows the links between these struggles, you know, which Susan referred to about, you know, the international nature of the working class movement, that people in the metropolitan countries did see the struggles as being the same. And, you know, there is a proud history in many countries of the working class movement being involved in solidarity struggles. Just on Tony's last point about the Eugene Rogan blog about the nature of Zionism and so forth, I think the debate's an interesting one, if only from the point of view that you might want to frame it about whether Zionism is essential to the British imperial project in the Middle East in that period, and indeed later. I think that Rogan's attempt to try and separate imperialism and Zionism, trying to infer that it's a sort of you know, a sort of permanent interest, and that Britain will rely upon one and then another, does have a certain element of truth. On occasions, concessions are made. On occasion, Zionism is reined in. But I think that in essence, you know, there have been a number of books on this. I'm trying to think of his name, the chap from Manchester, Kellerman, Peter Kellerman, I think it is, has written on the relationship between the British Labour Movement and Zionism, but also in terms of British imperialism. Then I think that the argument is that Zionism is, in that period, is a useful instrument. Britain refers to the Zionists as creating an Ulster in the Middle East, and I think that it's regarded as a stabilizing factor. So, you know, in that sense, I think that Rogan is wrong. But again, Tony, a topic which could be covered, I think, in the autumn, certainly maybe about Britain's relationship with the politics of the Middle East, which is, you know, as with so much else about British imperialism, is often ignored. Anyway, those are my comments.
Thank you, Kevin. Are there any more questions or comments? Then please click raise hand now. If not, I wonder if you want to say anything else to sum up, Kevin, or shall we take what you just said as a summing up?
I will just make a few little comments, but only a very small number, Tina.
Go on, and yes, there are no more hands up, so thank you.
Yeah, good. I've yes, I often do this. I reduce people to shock silence. Okay, comrades. Well, thanks for the questions. As I said, this was primarily a sort of, you know, preparation for, you know, the later topics, the ones that are going to develop next in the next sessions in the autumn. I think why the history is so important and why we should understand the relationship of empire and to the struggles against empire is, of course, that our movement, the working class movement, has an interest in the liberation of all countries. And the argument that that empires are in a sense progressive, the arguments that colonial peoples were not able to govern themselves, are very similar often to situations that we hear today, which require the intervention of capitalist powers. I mean, how many times have we heard those sorts of arguments when it comes to the wars in Iraq, to Libya, to Syria, to Afghanistan? Or perhaps, you know, another more refined version of this is that the empire's intervention is necessary to assist the liberation, and so we need to stay there in order to complete some sort of modernizing project in that way. I think I think that the way the discussion has gone, to particularly point out the role of the movement in the imperialist countries and the way that governments use empires, I think is a useful one, because in understanding that history, we understand something about the nature of our own movement. And we also, I think, understand something about the nature of our own ruling class. The ruling class was quite prepared to use the most bloody methods to maintain its rule. In my lifetime, not that I was particularly conscious because I was a fairly small child, but the British Army in Kenya carried out the most horrific repression to maintain that colony in the 1950s. And that is now largely forgotten. There have been a number of legal cases recently about this, but the files have been destroyed. And indeed, the historical record and indeed the historical memory has also been destroyed. So in a session like this, we're reminding ourselves, and hopefully we're arming ourselves to know that there were anti-colonial struggles, that the peoples of the empire fought back against their oppressions, demand for independence, and that they did this through mass political movements. You know, the India movement, which I dealt with, has often been the subject of a great deal of literary and media representation, but the particular focus on Gandhi, who's become a sort of a saintly-like figure, and the role of the masses and the role of a real struggle that was met with repression is often, I think, sort of played down. And so it's that I think we need to think about, the two sides of the coin, the struggle against imperialism within the empire, but also the necessary solidarity which was shown on occasions, but also in terms of the leadership, also grievously betrayed, that these are two sides of the same coin in their struggle, which is really international. And if we've learned anything in these sessions, it is that international dimension. So that's my conclusion, comrades.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very important conclusion, I think, that we can all take home with us. Thank you, comrades, for joining us tonight. We'll see you for one last session in this series next week. Kevin, could you just quickly tell us what next week's going to be about?
Well, we're going to have a roundtable, Tina, involving some of the speakers. Or if I can't get some of the speakers back, because it's sort of holiday time in different places, then a couple of comrades who will be talking, perhaps in a general overview about the period and what we've learned from it, and indeed what we still think we need to look at. So it's a sort of a summing up. And I would actually say that I think the summing up is one in which people from the floor should come in, rather than just have some talking heads. That's a good question, but they've also got plenty of comments to make. So we're really looking at the whole period of revolution and counter-revolution between 1914 and 1939. And
there were a few of them, weren't there?
There were.
In that period, as we've learned. So thank you, comrades. Make some notes for next time so you can come in. Also, if you want to speak from the top table, so to speak, let us know. As you can hear, there is space available. So send us an email, info@labourleft.org. Have a good evening. See you soon. Bye-bye, comrades.
Okay, bye.